everyone, and welcome to the Week 10 video for cross-cultural negotiations. I hope you enjoyed your experience of negotiating international lodging merger. To remind us of what we did in class, we negotiated for 60 minutes on a negotiation that took place between two parties, AAA and Lambert Hotel, both hotel groups that are based in different countries. Then we did a debrief and of course got ready for next week. When you are reflecting on your experience as an international lodging merger, here are a few things to consider. Think about what are the impact, or what was the impact of the values and the culture. Now, in your case, of course, I noted several times that the culture is a bit it's not authentic. It's not an authentic representation of culture, but it does try to write in behaviors, rewards for behaviors in the case that are consistent with differences in values. And values really are what underlie our cultural differences. So what was the impact of those values on your negotiation? And you can think of that as an approximation for what the impact of culture is on a negotiation. For some of you, this experience was quite frustrating. So what was it that was frustrating about this negotiation? Why were you frustrated? At what moments did you get frustrated? And when you reflect on it, especially after our debrief, were your frustrations tied to any of the values that were revealed throughout the course of the negotiation? What were the sticking points, the biggest issues? Again, were these culturally influenced? What were the factors in coming to an agreement? What made you get past any of the frustrations? What made you actually move towards deciding on or coming to a set of outcomes that you could agree on? So these are the types of things that are worth reflecting on when you're thinking about your experiences with international lodging merger. To remind you of some of the details, international lodging merger is a case that takes place between the AAA hotel chain from Brazil and Lambert, a US-based hotel chain. So within the case, you had written in several manipulations that were intended to mimic the cultural differences between Brazil and the U.S. So, for example, Brazil was rewarded for finding out information about Lambert, the representatives from Lambert, getting to know them, getting to know more about them, and getting to know personal details, something that would be unusual within a North American business setting or a US or Canadian business setting. And in the US, there was a reward for time, for coming in and finishing under time, because, again, time is something that is highly valued in a US or Canadian business context. So the two parties had written into their case differences that were meant to highlight aspects of the culture. Now, when we talk about culture, of course, we're talking about values, ways of behaving, traditions, stories, things that are representative of our group, of the large group of people that happen to live or that live together in a geographic location, or that are connected through a nationality or ethnicity. I want to preface this discussion by noting that we can make strong generalizations about culture that don't apply to every single person within the country that we're discussing. There is more variance between people than there is between cultures. There's more just differences in behavior and personalities and all of the things that drive us as individuals. There's quite a great deal of variance. So just to be cautious about how we use culture, there are appropriate ways of discussing the differences that exist between ways of behaving, because I think we can all agree that there are norms and ways of doing things that are certainly distinct depending on our cultural differences and our cultural backgrounds. And that's what we're going to talk about in this lecture. We're going to focus on culture as a set of norms that influence and inform, and a set of values that influence and inform how we behave. So in the case that you had several business issues that you were talking about, but the cultural background, the lens that you viewed those business issues from had an enormous impact on the outcomes that you could achieve. So just as a reminder, there was a ZOPA in this case. There was both AAA and Lambert had resistance points and target points. But it was really difficult to find the ZOPA in this case. We often hear in cross-cultural negotiations the comment that I couldn't find the ZOPA, or I didn't know where the ZOPA was. When you're speaking, and when I say this, I don't mean different languages as in different, as in English versus Portuguese, which would be the difference between the US and Brazil, but I mean you're speaking in using different frames, different lenses, different ways of viewing the world, which can make it very difficult to understand where the overlap is between your points of view. We'll unpack that idea a little bit more as we go through this discussion or this video lecture, but I wanted to point out that your aim is still the same. It's still to find the zone of potential agreement and make an agreement that is mutually agreeable to both parties. There's just the added challenge of finding that zone. There are many things that stand in the way of being able to identify the zone of potential agreement. As we noted in class, and as written to this case, as an example of something that makes it difficult to find the zone of potential agreement, is in the Brazilian case, the case where AAA, that's represented by AAA, you are explicitly instructed to make a very extreme opening offer, right? And what do we know about opening offers? From our first day together, we know that opening offers can often offend people. And we know that if something seems to be off the table, then it looks as though the person that you're negotiating with didn't arrive with the intention of negotiating in good faith. And so you're in a difficult position and you don't feel that that you really could come to a deal. So an extreme opening offer in Canada and the US can actually cause the other party to leave the table. Can actually say, well, you didn't even come here to negotiate, I'm out of here. But as we talked about in class, in other cultures and other ways of negotiating, an extreme opening offer is necessary because extreme opening offers allow you to make a great deal of movement. You can move from $100 to $90 to $80 to $70 to $60 and so on and so on. If you do not make an extreme opening offer, as is the case typically with North American negotiations, we start much more closely together, but we make smaller movements. If we are not willing to make many and large movements, in other cultures, we are often seen as, not bargaining in good faith and not coming to the table and being resistant and not being willing to make a deal. So in the way that we've been approaching negotiations, extreme opening offers are viewed as offensive. However, in other parts of the world, an extreme opening offer is the norm and is actually necessary for the process of negotiation. Otherwise, you will offend because you will be seen as stuck in your position. So there is a very clear example of a cultural distinction that's going to make it hard to understand where the ZOPA lies. We both start, we talked on our first day about wanting to start in the sweet spot, which is just outside the ZOPA, whereas AAA would want to start way to the right of this graph so that they can move themselves in along that pink block to find their way into the ZOPA. Okay. So when negotiating, first of all, the importance of negotiating internationally. As we know, this is a very old reference, actually. I should update that one because there are many references to support this idea that, and I wasn't lecturing in 1984, so no, this is not an original reference. I think this is a reference that was in an earlier version of the textbook that you're using. But the reference still holds the idea that even more so today, we are conducting negotiations that are global, they cross boundaries, managers spend a great deal of time negotiating, and as this world becomes more and more connected, those negotiations will increasingly take place across cultural barriers. So as a manager, it's imperative that you understand and are versed in and skilled at negotiating, not just from your own frame and your own perspective and your own way of viewing the world, but as a global skill, and a cultural skill. When we talk about cultural negotiations, here are the spaces wherein there can be differences in negotiation, in the approach to negotiation. There can be basic concepts of the process that are different. We just talked about one, this idea of the extreme opening offer and how you make concessions, patterns of concession making. Those can be quite different across cultures. Negotiator criteria can be quite different across cultures. So, for example, in the case that we did this week, it was quite clear that if you were in AAA, you had to identify the person in Lambert who was most senior, who was the decision maker, and only direct your questions and your conversations at that individual. You were only really willing to bargain with the person who had decision-making power. Often, we see cultures that want to know that they're bargaining with somebody who's at least at the same level as them. There's a power distance issue. We'll discuss that term in just a moment. But it means that it has implications for who should come to the table. And when people do come to the table, it has implications for who should lead or is taken as the implicit leader of the negotiation. Another point is the significance of the issue. How significant an issue is going to depend on culture again. So an issue such as naming and whose name goes first might be a cultural issue, something that's culturally significant. The protocol, again, who speaks to whom, what order you enter the room, what order you discuss things in, who speaks first, who speaks second, all of these things can be culturally influenced. What the relationships looks like, and this is one that was clear in your case. In Canada and the US, and I say those in the same breath, but I do not in any way equate our cultures because they are quite different. But in Canada, the case has a US example, so for the purposes of this case, I will draw references in places we are similar. So in Canada and the US, we have in terms of negotiations with business partners, we have this need to keep those relationships fairly professional, which to us means arm's length. We don't get overly chummy. We don't talk about personal matters. We don't share things that we believe are inappropriate. And inappropriate typically means personal. So for us, those are boundaries we don't cross. Whereas in other countries, it's perfectly reasonable to ask somebody their age, whether they're married, if they have children. All of these things are perfectly appropriate, where they would be a bit taboo locally. Time is another consideration, how comfortable. Different cultures have different comfort levels with time. In North America, as you know, we have a great deal of time pressure. Time, we talk, and even in our language, time is money. We desperately want to protect our time and use our time wisely, and we don't. We get frustrated or angry with people when they waste our time. So all of these things interfere with our ability to negotiate because we feel these immense time pressures over the course of a negotiation. We have to reach a deal in the allotted time period. Whereas there are other cultures that are perfectly content, putting things to the side, waiting with longer timelines, really. We in North America measure in US and Canada, measure things in quarters. So we divide the year into 4, and our business cycle is such that we reevaluate everything after 4 months. Each 4 months. Whereas in other parts of the world, 4 months is not even close to enough time to get anything significant done. And there's a much longer orientation on business cycles and on life in general in terms of how things are measured. So time is another issue in terms of a space where there are cultural differences, and one that has implications for how we behave within a negotiation. You will find that, and you felt this throughout the class, I'm sure, where you feel quite pressured, especially when time is running out on a negotiation, whereas others will be much more comfortable. This might have been the case within virtual Victorian in particular, where you noticed that you versus some of your colleagues had different preferences for time and the willingness to wait till later in the week or later in the day. There's also differences in considerations of how we form trust. In North America, we form trust based on agreements, contracts, making concessions and trading things off and making rules about how we will divide up the resources, and then we write it all down and we have it signed, and that's our basis for trust. Whereas in other parts of the world, the basis for trust can be just the relationship itself or some other factor or function. So again, here's a space where cultures differ within negotiations. And lastly on this list, although this is not by any means an exhaustive list, but here's another point, the nature of persuasive arguments. What is actually going to persuade somebody to want to behave or to agree with you, right? So we come up with our rationalizations, and all semester we've been really, really careful about coming up with strong arguments for the points that we believe in and the points that we've been asked to argue. And what is going to convince somebody is quite different locally as compared to in other parts of the world. So the frame of fairness differs. What is fair and what is unfair? The frame of success, what is a good outcome, will differ from one to another. So this is also another space where you might be met with some frustration or some challenge. In this particular negotiation, here are the spaces on which you saw significant difference. One of them is power. And this was represented in the way that the AAA was asked to speak only to the most powerful member of the Lambert team, because there is a great deal of respect for certain indicators of power in different cultures, be it age, education, status within an organization, legitimate power. Any of those things can mean a lot within other cultural contexts. In the US and Canada, we actually have fairly low power distance, meaning that even in university, students, some of you call me Dr. Bedworth, some of you call me Professor Bedworth, and some of you call me Marie. That would be unheard of in other parts of the world. Don't fret, I'm perfectly comfortable with any of those. But it's an interesting indication of our understandings of and our tolerance of indicators of power. Another function on which people differ is to the extent that they're motivated by benefiting themselves as an individual or benefiting their community, the group of people that they belong to. In North America, and I think this is a fairly easy generalization to make, if North America, Canadian and US has a strong value system that's towards the individual, right? It's in our storytelling, it's in our models for success, our movies, that lone individual who comes out and does well and achieves great success. We all feel good about this kind of individual approach to success. Whereas in other parts of the world, success isn't considered as, or an individual is less likely to consider themselves and the benefits that they're going to get individually, and more likely to think about community benefit, or the benefit that they might get for their family or the people that live near them or their city or their town. And this distinction is called individualism collectivism. Another distinction continuum that we have is particularism versus universalism. And this distinction describes the situation where we in North America, in Canada and the US, have rules and regulations and policies that apply to everybody. And they apply to everybody without consideration often. Not always, but often. They apply to everybody and there's no exception. So that's universalism. That's where the same standards are used for everybody because that's fair and just. Whereas in other parts of the world, there is a lens of particularism. And that means that that views people as different, respects differences, and tries to find solutions based on the differences between individuals. Uh, every rule is meant to be broken. Nothing applies to everybody, right? So people are considered as individual and independent. All of these dimensions, power distance, individualism versus collectivism, universalism versus particularism, are part of Hofstede's model of culture. Now, I'm sure you've come across Hofstede's model in other courses, particularly OB and probably some other courses. It's not a flawless model. It's a model that certainly can be criticized. And one of the criticisms is that it oversimplifies cultural differences. Certainly, absolutely. But it's still a useful way of thinking about the ideas that there are large patterns of how people in different parts of the world view important factors that kind of underlie the norms of behavior within those parts of the world. So the ones that we've identified here are the ones that are written into your case, but they're also ones that will have a significant impact on negotiations. So individualism and collectivism, I don't think I've brought that one up yet, is written into your case in that in your case there's a reward system discussed, and the US is trying to push the model that they already have in the Lambert hotels in the US, where they incentivize, whereas Brazil is much more concerned about the fact that people have different properties and not all properties are equal, the managers of these hotels. We already discussed the universalism, particularism dimension in the idea of a contract and the way in which deals are made. Okay. So the learning points from this particular negotiation are that attempts to convert opponents rarely work. There are differences in assumptions, values, and beliefs. So just arguing your point of view, your rationalizations, your frame, your view of the world is not going to cut it in a cross-cultural negotiation. And in fact, it might offend. Your view of the world, your way of arguing, has so much of you tied up into it that it's going to be quite a challenge for it is not appropriate to act as a rationalization to help influence somebody else. So in a negotiation, a cross-cultural negotiation in particular, you have to be aware of your own lens and your opponent's in order to be able to facilitate agreement. So there has to be, if you're dealing cross-culturally, some research of how business is done, what are protocols, what's etiquette, as simple as that, right? All of these things are going to become quite important when we're thinking about cultural differences. In this last one, cross-cultural differences have integrative potential but handle with care. I want to address the idea that some of you in your negotiations may have felt frustrated, angry, emotional at one point or another because people seem to be, I heard the comment, I think they were trying to stall the negotiation with some of their behaviors. Well, that feeling, when you're negotiating cross-culturally and you run up against that feeling of being frustrated, of being angry, quite likely it's not the appropriate reaction to the situation, because no one is trying to frustrate you or make you feel angry. What you're likely feeling is a difference in normative behavior, a different way of operating that don't overlap, that you don't understand, or that doesn't coincide with your own way of behaving. That can frustrate, and certainly within that there is integrative potential, but you need to be very careful that you're not also offending and stalling negotiations through your own behavior. So as an example, in this case, one of the integrative ways that this case can be solved is for AAA to be allowed to ask questions, but perhaps Lambert says, I will answer all of your questions if we are still able to finish this case under the time allotted in 55 rather than 60 minutes. Now again, this is only an approximation. This is quite contrived. That's not a deal that can be made in real life. But within this case, here's an example of the preferences for time and the need for relationship building can be traded off. In the real world, you'll be looking for other more subtle, probably more realistic trade-offs, but here we go. Here's an example from this case that that might be useful for you to think about. So cross-cultural negotiations, we need to find out as much in preparation for them. We need to find out as much as possible about the expectations and the behaviors associated with the other culture in advance, recognizing the distinction between cultural norms and stereotypes. We don't want to go into a negotiation with expectations that are largely based on propaganda or some sort of incorrect information, or some unflattering information that is unfounded. Recognize that behaviors of others that you find offensive or silly may actually be culturally initiated. So again, tune into yourself and recognize that frustration might be a response to something that just isn't what you're used to. Recognize that you may be offending others by your behavior. This is the classic example of you often see in movies this old Texan with his Stetson hat going into a negotiation being loud and boisterous and wearing his cowboy boots and putting feet up on table, and all of that is incredibly offensive. And also, so just recognizing that while you could be perceived as frustrated, you could be frustrated yourself, you can also be perceived as frustrating. Recognize that some things which appear as no-brainers, in this case the example would be pay for performance, are actually culturally influenced and might not actually work. So the preferences for outcomes and expectations will be culturally influenced, and you want to make sure that you're not making false assumptions about what people will and will not prefer. Look at differences for integrative possibilities. So we've talked about this in this particular case, the difference in time. There are, in real world situations rather, there will be many opportunities for integrative potential in cross-cultural negotiations, and it will be a skilled negotiator who's be able to identify them and maximize the joint gain through the creative solution making. All right, so that's it for cross-cultural negotiations this week. Next class, we will be negotiating the best stuff on earth. I look forward to seeing you there.